On November 27th, 2004, Toho released what was said to be the final film in the Godzilla franchise, to never be touched again, and to be looked at as the final nail in the coffin to the longest continuous running film franchise of all time. In 2005, however, news began popping up about a 40-minute Godzilla 3D IMAX film called Godzilla 3D Cinemax. Produced by Godzilla vs. Hedorah director Yoshihiro Banno, this was later dropped in favor of Legendary Pictures to obtain the rights for an American reboot. March 29th, 2010, Legendary Pictures announces the collaboration with Warner Brothers, the rights to the monster, and a release date for the film set for 2012. Many fans were skeptical, however, since the last attempt at an American reboot was in 1998 and was absolute garbage. July 2012, director Gareth Edwards shows the first concept teaser, and holy fucking shit, it was beautiful. September 2012, Legendary announces a new release date of the film set for May 16th, 2014, but no one gave a shit because everyone was still gushing over the trailer like December 10th, 2013, Legendary releases the first official teaser for the film, and the fans reacted like February 25th, 2014, Legendary releases the first main trailer, and the fans. And within the subsequent months, the advertising of the film grew more and more, a perfect storm of marketing and hype. May 16th, 2014, Godzilla 2014 unleashed in theaters, and the hype was expulsed from us like the perfect night in the bedroom that left craving more every night. The film, however, did not have the same results for every person. While many loved the film for what it tried to accomplish, many felt that the movie dragged, didn't earn its final act, and the characters were uninteresting. This led to many online internet wars, debates, and analytical videos that still got flack, even though what they were trying to say was valid. And even an internet series that spawned out of it. But why? What happened to cause such hate towards the film and yet such praise all at once? Well, today we'll be answering just that. This is Godzilla, the Almost Perfect Reboot.
Japan, arigato. What are you doing?
In the Godzilla 2014 film, director Gareth Edwards and director of photography Seamus McGarvey have created a storyboard with a cinematic style that not only engages the audience through the presentation, but brings the spectacle of the film to life in ways we have never seen before in a kaiju film. Godzilla 2014 is a very seamless film when it comes to its cinematography and editing, and while there are many ways to create this seamlessness in a film, three main techniques used here are cutting at the action, having the sound of the next shot fill in from the current shot, and then cutting to the next shot,
Alright, heads up, we've got a new destination.
or having long takes, or even just one shot being the scene.
It is imperative that we do so.
But more importantly, how Gareth and Seamus more or less use the third technique is how the style of the film shines. While many films might have a static shot of a character talking for 5 minutes straight, during many shots in Godzilla 2014, the camera often moves around to show what needs to be emphasized within the shot without making a cut unless it's absolutely necessary. Take the quarantine house scene for example, when Joe Brody tries to find his old discs. Instead of cutting back and forth from his face to declare the discs, they instead keep it within a single shot, moving the camera to either Joe's face or to debris the discs when it needs to be focused on. This in turn makes it so when they do cut, it feels very impactful. To further elaborate, Godzilla 2014 did many dynamic transitions from the medium shot to the wide shot, and vice versa, that can be seen throughout the film. Many of these were attained through clever location and minor movements from the camera that took you from one establishment of the scene to the next. And when they couldn't do that, they often resorted to the audio technique earlier discussed, and even through visual parallels, such as the last shot of the Philippines, where the camera tilts to the ocean and then cuts to the ocean shores of Jinjiro, Japan, which not only gives us a nice transition, but gives us the hint that the creature that escaped from the Philippines has arrived to Jinjiro. Gareth and Seamus not only make their shots efficient with their lack of cuts and parallels, but also by packing the shots with information. A wonderful example of this would be the opening scene when Monarch heads to the dig site in the Philippines. You get a wide shot of the helicopter coming in with the name of the mining company causing the incident on the mid-ground of the shot, and another sign of the company on the right third of the screen once it moves into a medium shot of the helicopter landing. While it's nothing super important for us to know, it's still nice to have the information there if you want to look for it. Another example of this would be when young Ford peeks into his father's office and sees his father talking to his boss about the tremors happening near the site. However, if you look around in his office, you can see the wave pattern of these tremors on the computer screen. Now, if you know anything about tremors and their wave patterns, you would know that the normal tremor looks like this. What we see on Ford's computer is not normal for a tremor. And if you knew this looking at Ford's computer screen on first viewing, you can better understand why Ford is pushing so much for a meeting to his boss. Again, this is not necessary info for the story, as the waveform is further explained later in the film, but it's a cool piece of info for those who look for it.
There. Something responded.
While the cinematography had excellent presentation on the humans, what about the monsters? Thankfully, the two minds of Gareth and Seamus did not hold back on the monsters in their view through the lens. Monster movies have shown the creatures in all sorts of lights, wides, close-ups, and close-ups that are too close to make out of anything, low angles, high angles, and even POVs of humans. But knowing Gareth, he wanted his presentation of the creatures to be special, something no other kaiju film has done. And at least to my knowledge, he made the camera act like a human. But not exactly like this. Almost every shot of the monsters in the film is from a human's perspective, by having the camera be behind or near a human watching what you're seeing on screen. This was done to such an extreme that the writers literally wrote snipers to be on the rooftops of buildings just to have the human's perspective of the monsters fighting in the third act. And oftentimes, they didn't even have a human there. They would just place the camera in places where the human would be, and sometimes they would have pretty good continuity with it too. When the reactor site begins preparation for the attempted assassination of the creature in the first act, you see Ford look into the distance of the helicopter taking off. And in the very next shot, you get a bird's eye view of the cocoon as if someone from the helicopter is looking down at it. This technique makes the creatures feel grounded and massive, which is further enhanced by the depth the crew implemented in the film, with many of the wide shots of the creatures containing a foreground, midground, and background, which usually contains a monster. This gives the viewer numerous everyday objects to compare the monster to throughout the film, which gives the feeling that these are truly ginormous creatures. Gareth and Seamus also captured the size of the creatures by almost never having the entire creature in frame. Much like in Game of Thrones, the dragons always look massive in the show because their entire body is never shown within the frame. They leave part of them out so the viewer has the mystery of how big they really are. And in Godzilla 2014, this is no exception. The entire film shows almost every body part of the creatures throughout the film. It usually starts with a body part every time a monster is introduced into a scene up until the third act. Using the monster's body parts not only acts as a scaling purpose for the creatures to the surrounding environment, but also creates build-ups to the monsters entering the scene. With the human perspective being used effectively for the monsters, it's not only used for the monsters, it's also sprinkled into some human scenes as well. Take this shot for example. The camera could have easily been on a tripod here with a slight pan when Joe runs into a room. But instead they had the camera rush into the room with Joe, giving the feel that we're running with him to save his wife, and thus giving a human's perspective. When it came to Godzilla 2014's musical score, Gareth Edwards had two options. Either have a score that heavily caters towards the franchise roots, or create a completely original score that'll cater more towards the general audience. Thankfully, with Gareth Edwards' knowledge of the fandom and the skills of musical composer Alexander Desplat, we got the best of both. The original Gojira was composed by the legendary composer Akira Ifukube, which used his favorite instrument, the violin, to compose the majority of the film. Musical placements within the film, which usually contain the violin, were in intense and sad moments, and little to no music during the normal dialogue scenes. Aside from the violin, Ifukube used percussion and brass to convey any type of overwhelming force in the film, and that force was Gojira. Ifukube's scores was also one of the more unique scores of the time, being one of, if not the first composer to bring ostinato into cinema, which is a fancy word for a melody that repeats. Ifukube's tactics to the ostinato score struck fear into the hearts of many when first released onto the silver screen. Despite Godzilla 2014's score having none of Akira Ifukube's pieces, many of his practices are. Many of the dialogue scenes in Godzilla 2014 are absent of music unless the dialogue is meant to have emotion behind it, or a scene is trying to build up to something, which goes against many present-day film practices that normally has some type of ambient music in the background. Godzilla 2014 also has many ostinato tracks, like the opening track of the title sequence, which is used throughout the film. But not only that, Alexandre Desplat uses the violin for sad and intense moments in the film, much like Ifukube, but also diverges from Ifukube by using various percussion instruments, vocals, and other unique sound effects to create a chilling atmosphere that can get you hooked. However, despite the amazing score produced for the film, it seems like Desplat was upset with a part of the project. Despite all these caveats from the score, one scene from the film uses a track very similar to, or even the exact track from 2001: A Space Odyssey's track called Requiem. And while fitting for the scene, some may say it's almost disconnected from the rest of the film's soundtrack. This was most likely a decision on Gareth Edwards' part, most likely to him having the track Requiem for a rough cut, and either one of the original track or something as close to it as possible without violating copyright. Temp music in relation to directors and musical composers is abysmal to say the least, and Alexandre Desplat had a strong opinion on it on an interview that took place months after the release of Godzilla 2014.
Everybody's different about that. For me, temp music is the bane of my existence.
It's getting worse and worse, I feel, with the directors I work with.
And they're using more?
Because of the Avid, because of digital. Because when it was MAG, there was not that I'm that old.
No, absolutely.
But it was different because they wouldn't lay so easily music and so many CDs, throw them to the picture and then listen to them again and again and again for hours and hours and make a new DVD they watch at home when they go back and then another version the next day with the same music. And at some point the music sticks to the picture. Any good music sticks.
They could spend a year with it before you arrive.
Of course, so it's connected, it's strongly connected. It's merged, it's merged into it. So, as you say, I tried to see the movie with no music first, and then listen to the temp once or twice. But there's only one director I know who never uses temp track. Maybe you know others, but Roman Polanski is the only one.
I know none.
He doesn't need it. He says, he's doing his editing, and when the movie's there, it's there.
Based on the interview and the scene with the Odyssey-like score, it's understandable that Alexandre Desplat might not have been happy going with that piece for that scene.
It's stopped. Yes. 8:15 in the morning, August 6, 1945.
Hiroshima.
It was my father's.
While the previous aspects of Godzilla 2014 can be held to a high regard, the plot points and character decisions of the story were some of the more debatable aspects of the film.
I'm right, aren't I?
Looking at the core of the story, it's quite a simple tale. An earthquake occurs in the mining station where spores of the enemy species of Godzilla get awoken, and thus Godzilla emerges once again to kill the threat of the monsters, while the humans try to figure out how to kill the monsters from harming more of their civilization.
Will it work? Can they be killed? But we tried that before.
We're talking dialable yield, megatons, not kilotons. Nothing can withstand that blast.
It's quite a simple tale, but contains a lot of moving parts, with many of the scenes discussing what the humans should have done as the revelations of the events transpire in the second and third act, leaving the first act for its development of its human characters, and the characters they do develop, they do a phenomenal job doing so. In particular, Joe Brody gets a majority of the development, having him work at the nuclear power plant, trying to solve the mystery behind the seismic frequencies, and in trying to solve it, unexpectedly leads his wife to her death, having to even seal the door to her escape to save everyone in Jinjiro, and now the almost deranged character seeks proof of what really happened on that day.
And you keep telling everybody that this place is a death zone, but it's not. You're lying.
Unfortunately, by the end of the first act, the character Joe Brody dies, and his son Ford Brody takes the permanent role as the protagonist in the film. This leads to one of the two major issues audiences had with the film by pulling a psycho, not executing it in the best manner. I want to take a moment and refer to this quote from The Closer Look on his Knives Out analysis about plot twists and subverting people's expectations to explain what makes subversion, or twist, effective.
Realize that there are three core rules that decide whether or not your subversion of expectation will be an asset to your story or a detriment. And the first rule to making any form of subversion, shock, or twist in your story good is it must enhance your story going forward. Secondly, it must have a strong verisimilitude with the story's logic that's come before. And thirdly, this is the big one, this is the main reason why The Last Jedi's twists and turns just didn't work. It has to be in keeping with all the promises that you've made so far to your audience.
With the death of Brody, it's clear that Gareth Edwards and Max Bornstein wanted to subvert people's expectations, which is fine. Plenty of films have done so, but the problem is the subversion failed one of the three rules stated by The Closer Look. The death of Brody passes Rule 2, as it makes sense for how he died within the situation that happened in the Jinjiro plant near the end of Act 1. The death also debatably passes Rule 3, as no promises were technically made that were broken. However, this can be debated, as Brody was seen to be the protagonist, only to be killed a third of the way through the film. This is counter-argued by the fact that Psycho did something very similar, and it worked with flying colors. So when looking at Rule 1 for the death of Joe Brody, we have a fairly well-executed character with clear motives and a complex background that we can get behind and sympathize. And that gets traded out with his son Ford Brody, who we know significantly less, as the first act tells us more about Joe, as well as Joe just being the more interesting character of the two.
My wife died here. Something killed my wife.
With Ford, we know that he was an outsider looking in on the Horde situation that happened that day the Muto destroyed the plant, and distances himself from his father because of how obsessed he became over that day. We know that he is in the US military as an ordnance disposal operative and has a kid and a wife that he loves from only one scene, and that's really it. So comparing the two's development from when the subversion occurs, this trade-off with the protagonist seems like a downgrade for the story. Now this could be corrected if throughout the film we learn more about Ford, to the point that we care for him more than we did for Joe. But unfortunately, this is not the case, as we said earlier. The only things different about Ford from the death of his father to the end of the film is that he saves a child in Hawaii and decides to help the military with delivering the nukes, along with helping to deactivate one of them, just so he can be in the city to find his son and wife again. And to many people, this was not enough to care for him or make him interesting enough as a character compared to Joe Brody, and thus failing the subversion for a large portion of the audience. Now, a failed subversion can lower the enjoyment of the average viewer, but not kill the movie for said viewer, unless you put multiple failed subversions or twists in a film, like Star Wars: The Last Jedi, or other factors that can lower the enjoyment. However, Godzilla 2014 did something else that caused many to lose their enjoyment, with that being how they teased the action in the film. Teasing anything in film can be a highly effective tool in bringing the horror towards a creature to life, like in Jaws and the Babadook, as well as being able to hype up a big event in a film like the end of Lord of the Rings to Two Towers with the Battle of Helm's Deep. And with Gareth Edwards, he likes showing the destruction of the creatures left in their wake to show the monster's capabilities without showing the literal actions, leaving your imagination to think of just how powerful these monsters could be. Unfortunately, the way Gareth portrayed this tease in Godzilla 2014 left many viewers cheated and or disappointed. This is so because instead of just showing the destruction left awake from the creature, he often showed the monster just before he causes the destruction or fight and then cuts to a different scene, only for the next scene to show the aftermath of said destruction and or fight scene. Now, not all of these teases follow the same format, as there are some that follow Gareth's older works, but the amount of times the film sets up something only for it to cut away or show a mitigated version of it left people dissatisfied with the film up till the end of the second act. Now, counter arguments have been made that the presentation of the teases made the third act more memorable, which is fair to say that that's what the tease was there for. But let's set aside the whole scenario of how Gareth portrayed the monsters and say that you were working an office job. Your boss is supposed to give you a Christmas bonus at the end of the day, and throughout the day he constantly shows you the bonus check with the gift cards and sorts that tells you that you're going to get it later in the day, which is fine the first time, but the boss does it again and again throughout the day, showing you and debating you on when you'll really get it, and by the time you actually do get it, by the end of the day, your excitement for that bonus has now dissipated. Now, if we change the situation around, instead of debating the employee on the bonus, you tell him that at the end of the shift, you'll get his Christmas bonus, and a few times throughout the day, you remind him of that bonus, giving him small hints on what it might be, and once the shift ends, he receives the bonus check in which he is ecstatic to see on how much the bonus is and what it was as a whole. Now, this is not to say that teases in Godzilla 2014 aren't effective for everyone, but there is a reason why people didn't like this aspect of the film. Though with all the negative comments said about the story, one thing that should be iterated is that the final climax of the film is exhilarating on almost all boards, providing a very grounded and realistic fighting from the monsters with very unique ways to showcase certain abilities and being creative with them, showing emotion in the creatures as well as structuring the battles to make them feel very tense, with the music amplifying it tenfold. With positives and negatives discussed in this video, these aspects cause many people to either enjoy or dislike the film, which caused much conversation and debate on the internet to similar levels that Star Wars: The Last Jedi had. But unfortunately, with fans of Godzilla 2014, we can't see the movie in the same light. Literally. When Godzilla 2014 came out, I watched it and had an amazing experience for myself. So much so that I watched it a total of 7 times in theaters. And to this day, I still remember the viewings quite well. So once when the film came to Blu-ray, I knew something was wrong upon the first shot after the title screen. At first I thought it was my TV not being optimized, but once I saw the atomic breath scenes, I knew right then and there that it wasn't my TV, but the physical copies itself. Since in theaters, the film didn't have the atomic breath looking like this. But this is the NPC footage for the film, which is much closer to what we saw in the theaters compared to the Blu-rays, because you never actually saw the core of the beam in theaters. And even comparing the film to the trailers that released before the film, you can see a clear difference in brightness and saturation, as if the home releases had a black filter placed on top of the footage. When this occurred, fans of the film argued if this was what we really saw in theaters, and what versions were the best. And according to the fans, after a year later, the 3D versions were the best. Unfortunately, when comparing the 3 now, there is little to no difference, sadly. Now, what caused the film to get this dark filter? Well, from what research I've done from back in the day, I have one theory. Back when studios wanted to get a home release for a film, they would often have to ship a copy of the film to a DVD/Blu-ray distribution company that would make a copy and place it into the DVDs and Blu-rays in mass production. Nowadays, with the use of better technology, studios would send their films digitally to these DVD/Blu-ray companies through use of high private tunnels that I like to call tubes. Now, these tubes can send enormous amounts of files within a matter of a few hours, instead of waiting a few days/weeks to receive it and paying for shipping too, with no risk to the product getting physically damaged. Now, with these tubes, there is a bug per se in which that on a random occasion, it'll place a green or yellow filter on the file being transmitted, with the green being associated with the Blu-ray copies and yellow with the 4K copies. As of now, people do not know why this occurs or how it is happening. My theory is that the transfer of the film through these tubes must have put a black filter on the home release version, despite there not being any reports of black filters being reported, because these tubes making this is an anomaly. Either that, or someone actually literally turned the brightness and saturation down by 100. Now, I have personally tried to remaster the footage to get it to look like how it was in theaters by comparing the home release footage to the trailers and NPC footage, and while I have managed to make some of the footage look relatively close to what I was comparing, the digital noise is just too much for me to accept it as a proper remaster. Thankfully, Warner Bros. And Legendary has released a 4K version of the film that is said to have remastered the original look of the film. Unfortunately, this is only for the 4K version, and it requires you to have a 4K TV/monitor, a 4K Blu-ray player, and a 4K HDMI cord. Not having any one of these will cause the film to not look as what it was intended in the theaters. And even then, there have been reports of it still being slightly darker than what it was in theaters. But at least after all these years, we have something that's relatively close. In conclusion to this long video, Godzilla 2014 is not a bad film by any means. It has some great camera work, effects, sound, and even acting in most regards. But the failure of subverting the audience with the protagonist Joe Brody dying in the first act, and the poor execution of teasing the monster fights and destruction scenes, along with some plot holes I didn't mention, prevents the film from being the perfect reboot. However, the film can still be very enjoyable if you have the patience and can accept its shortcomings. This was Godzilla 2014, the Almost Perfect Reboot.